For centuries, the word assassin has meant one thing: a hidden killer. A man in the shadows, waiting for the right moment to strike. But the people who inspired that legend were not fictional. They were real. They lived in medieval Persia and Syria. They built fortresses, maintained their own political state, fought much larger powers, and did carry out targeted political killings. And yet, some of the most famous stories about them have almost nothing to do with what we can actually prove. Stories of secret gardens, drugs, blind obedience, and men supposedly willing to die because they had been shown paradise. So what was real, and what became legend? To answer that, we have to go back to the mountains of medieval Persia. The people later known in Europe as the Assassins were part of the Nizari Ismaili movement, a branch of Shia Islam that emerged from a succession dispute within the Ismaili community in the late 11th century. Their story was deeply political as well as religious. In Persia, they lived under the rule of the Seljuk Turks, a powerful Sunni dynasty whose armies controlled much of the region. For the Nizaris, survival meant building a network of their own, and one man would become central to that effort. His name was Hasan-i Sabbah. He was an Ismaili missionary, organizer, political strategist, and eventually the leader of the Persian Nizaris. But he did not begin with an army. He began with a fortress, Alamut. In 1090, Hasan-i Sabbah seized the mountain fortress of Alamut through a carefully organized campaign of infiltration. The fortress stood in the Alborz Mountains, in a landscape that naturally favored defense. From there, Hassan began building something far more substantial than a hideout. Alamut became the center of what would develop into the Nizari Ismaili state in Persia. Other fortresses were acquired or constructed. Communities were organized. Agricultural systems were improved. And Alamut itself developed a library containing manuscripts and scientific instruments. This was not the lair of a fictional secret society. It was the center of a real political and religious state. But that state faced a serious problem. Its enemies were much more powerful militarily. The Seljuks could field armies. The Nizaris could not compete with them on the same terms. So Hassan needed another weapon. And this is where the historical assassins become genuinely frightening. Hassan developed a strategy suited to a decentralized enemy with overwhelming military power. Instead of trying to defeat entire armies, the Nizaris could strike individual political figures. Their assassinations were carried out by devoted followers, known as the Feda'is. The objective was not random killing, it was political. A single assassination could eliminate an important enemy without requiring a conventional army. One of the most famous early examples came in 1092, when the powerful Seljuk vizier Nizam al-Mulk was assassinated. The event was followed weeks later by the death of Sultan Malik Shah, creating a crisis inside the Seljuk state. The Nizari strategy did not destroy the Seljuks, but it demonstrated something important. A relatively small movement could make powerful rulers feel vulnerable. And that reputation would eventually become larger than the reality behind it. Because the more frightening the Nizaris became, the more extraordinary the stories surrounding them became. The real political movement was becoming a legend. Medieval observers began asking a disturbing question. How could anyone willingly carry out such dangerous missions? The answer they imagined was stranger than the reality. European chroniclers began circulating stories about a mysterious leader known as the Old Man of the Mountain. According to these accounts, young followers were supposedly introduced to intoxicating substances and transported into a hidden paradise. There, they were surrounded by gardens and pleasures.
Then they were removed from paradise and told that obedience to their master could eventually return them to it. The story offered a simple explanation for behavior that outsiders found difficult to understand. These men were not acting from conviction. They must have been drugged. But there is a major problem. There is no solid evidence that the Nizari Feda'is were systematically given hashish or another intoxicating drug to motivate them. Even Muslim sources hostile to the Nizaris do not provide evidence for such a practice. Instead, the connection between the Nizaris and hashish appears to have developed through a much more complicated chain of medieval terminology, prejudice, and storytelling. And that distinction changes the entire story, because the word assassin itself may have emerged from this hostile terminology.
The Nizaris were not the only people writing about themselves, and this is where history becomes difficult. During the Alamut period, the Nizaris maintained their own historical tradition. They recorded the reigns of their leaders and preserved accounts of their state. But those chronicles did not survive intact. When the Mongols destroyed the Nizari state in the 13th century, the libraries and fortresses containing these records were also destroyed. One important biography of Hasan-i Sabbah, the Sargozashti Sayyidna, has survived only indirectly through later Persian historians who had access to it. That means much of the surviving history comes through sources that were written from outside the Nizari community, sometimes by people who were openly hostile toward them. And when outsiders describe a secretive enemy they fear, reputation can quickly become evidence. The Nizaris were already known for political assassination, but stories about how they supposedly achieved that obedience began to grow. The real political movement was being transformed into a legend. By the 13th century, these stories had accumulated, and then they were woven together into one of the most famous versions of the assassin legend, Marco Polo. In his account, the leader of the assassins maintains a secret garden designed to resemble paradise. Young followers are supposedly brought into this garden after being drugged. They experience extraordinary pleasures. Then they are removed and told that their leader possesses the power to return them to paradise. The implication is simple. Obey, kill, die, and paradise will be yours again. It is an unforgettable story. But unforgettable does not mean historical. The important point is not that Marco Polo simply invented the entire assassin legend. The stories were already developing before him. Rather, his account helped bring several existing legends together into one powerful narrative and popularize the famous Paradise Garden version. By the 14th century, these stories had become widely accepted in Europe as supposed descriptions of the secret practices of the Nizaris, and the image of the drugged medieval assassin was born. So what survives when we strip away the legend? The Nizari Ismailis were real. Hasan-i Sabbah was real. Alamut was real. Their network of fortresses was real. And political assassinations carried out by their fidais were real. But the famous explanation for those assassinations is much harder to defend. There is no solid evidence establishing a system in which recruits were routinely drugged, shown a paradise garden, and psychologically conditioned to kill. The Old Man of the Mountain belongs largely to the language and imagination of medieval outsiders. And the association between hashish and the assassins is especially revealing. The Nizaris were called terms derived from hashishi by hostile sources. But those terms could function as insults. They did not necessarily mean that the people being insulted were actually consuming hashish. The later European stories transformed the insult into an explanation. The explanation became a legend. And the legend eventually became history in the popular imagination. That is why the historical assassins are so difficult to separate from the mythology surrounding them.
So, were the assassins really the fanatical killers described in medieval legend? The answer is more complicated. They were not imaginary. They were not simply a medieval invention. They were a real religious and political movement that built a state around a network of fortified strongholds. They used assassination as one of their political weapons, and they developed a reputation powerful enough to make much stronger enemies fear them. But the further we move away from those documented realities, the weaker the evidence becomes. The drugged recruits, the paradise garden, the supernatural obedience, the secret system of psychological control. These belong to a tradition of stories that developed over time. And ironically, the real history does not need those stories to be fascinating. The Nizaris survived for more than a century in a hostile political environment. They built fortified communities in difficult terrain. They confronted powers vastly larger than themselves. And for generations, they remained a persistent political threat. Their state in Persia finally fell when the Mongols under Hulagu attacked the Nizari strongholds. Alamut surrendered in 1256. The Persian Nizari state was destroyed, but the story of the assassins survived.
Today, the word assassin no longer refers only to a medieval community. It has become a word for a killer, a character, a weapon, a legend. And perhaps that is the strangest part of their history. The Nizaris built fortresses. They fought political enemies. They used targeted assassination. They created a state that lasted for generations. But what survived most completely was not their political system. It was the story told about them. A story of hidden gardens, secret masters, drugs, and perfect killers emerging from the shadows. The historical assassins were real, but the legend that surrounded them became something else. And sometimes, the most powerful thing a medieval enemy could leave behind was not a weapon. It was a story.